I only needed shelter. But this ruined workshop already knew my family's name.
No coat worth naming, no bank account, no place to return to, just a canvas tool roll and $5 she had hidden inside its hem. And with that $5, she bought a ruined porcelain doll-eyes kiln outside East Liverpool, Columbiana County, Ohio, where the property vanished from county maps in 1987. The chimney had split above the roofline. Green mold scaled the kiln's iron jacket. The county condemned the workshop on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for spring. But inside a blackened bismuth mold, behind a false core no hand had opened in 36 years, something patient waited to alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sylvie Ann Mercer had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Steubenville, she packed whenever rent notices appeared. Her belongings fit into a pillowcase, 2 shirts, a library card, a chipped blue cup. By 9, she could read a room from the way adults set down their keys. By 12, she knew questions cost more than silence. Her mother, Elaine, worked the breakfast shift at a roadside diner and came home smelling of coffee grounds and fryer oil. She kept wages inside a flour tin, then watched them disappear into overdue bills. When Sylvie asked what came next, Elaine rubbed her brow and said, "We will manage." The only place that held still was her grandmother's brick house near the river. Lenora Mercer restored damaged porcelain for museums, dealers, and families carrying dolls wrapped in towels. Every Saturday, Sylvie sat beside her at a scarred maple bench. Lenora mixed slip until it fell from a spoon in one ribbon, packed tiny hemispherical molds, and lifted half-formed eyes with tweezers. After firing, she brushed each curve with opal glaze, then painted an iris using one rabbit hair fixed into cedar. Blue held gray at the rim, amber near the pupil, and a red thread visible only when light turned foo. "Fire does not give a thing life," Lenora said. "It reveals what stayed honest inside it." Years later, Sylvie understood that her grandmother had meant more than porcelain. Lenora died in November 2016. While Sylvie sat through the funeral, cousins emptied the house. The kiln went to scrap, the formula books vanished, and the cedar brush case was sold with costume jewelry. Sylvie received only the chipped blue cup she had left there as a child. At 19, she moved in with Travis Bell because his apartment had clean windows and a lock that worked. He never struck her. He read her messages, corrected grocery receipts, and questioned every call to her mother. When Sylvie found work glazing souvenir plates, he put both wages into one account. By autumn, he came home after midnight with the metallic smell of casino air on his jacket. On March 14, 2023, Sylvie opened the banking app and found 11 cents. Travis had spent their savings on gambling debts and missed 2 months of rent. The landlord arrived carrying a red snow shovel, though no snow remained, and used its edge to push their belongings from the doorway while the lock was changed. "You have 10 minutes. Take only what's yours." Sylvie counted the 8 words because counting steadied her hands. She rolled Lenora's tweezers, a cracked loop, and one surviving brush into the canvas tool roll. Elaine stood at the curb in diner shoes, both hands around her purse strap. Sylvie waited for her to object, offer a couch, say Travis had lied. Elaine looked toward the upstairs window where he remained behind glass. When Sylvie lifted the pillowcase, her mother lowered her eyes. That silence closed the door. For 6, Sylvie followed the Ohio River with the weather. She slept beneath a picnic shelter in Steubenville behind laundromat dryers in Weirton, and for 3 nights on a church cot in Chester. In East Liverpool, she curled inside a disused bus shelter while river wind rattled an advertisement above her. Her money vanished by exact measures. $11 from selling her phone bought oatmeal, socks, and bus fare. $4.80 became bread, peanut butter, and aspirin. A gas station cashier gave her 2 quarters after seeing her count pennies for coffee. Sylvie carried them for 9 days. By the 6th Monday, $5 remained, folded inside the tool roll's hem where Travis had never found it. She entered the Carnegie Public Library to escape cold rain and sat beneath a radiator clicking like cooling china. On the community board between a lost terrier and piano lessons, a county posting hung crookedly. Abandoned industrial parcel, structure and contents $5. Buyer assumes all liability. The photograph showed a low workshop under walnut trees and, through a broken doorway, the rounded body of a kiln. At the desk, Sylvie asked for the parcel file. The librarian, a thin man with one silver hearing aid, studied her wet sleeves before sliding it across. Condemned doesn't mean worthless, he said. It means nobody wants the trouble. She read every page. The roof leaked. The well was untested. Taxes had been cleared through a reclamation program, but demolition would begin after winter. At the bottom of the inventory, one fading line read, "Porcelain ocular equipment. Origin unknown." Sylvie touched the tool roll beneath her coat. The rabbit hair brush inside was no thicker than a matchstick, yet she felt its shape against her ribs. Before closing, she spent 1/4 copying the directions and the other calling the county clerk. Then she unfolded the $5 bill and smoothed it against the table with both palms. By dawn, she was walking toward the bus station, carrying everything that had remained honest through the fire. The kiln was waiting at the end of the road. The bus carried Sylvie south through rain that silvered the windows and erased the far bank of the river. She rode from Steubenville to East Liverpool with the copied parcel directions folded inside her sleeve. The driver left her near the depot shortly after noon, where she learned the final county connection had been canceled months earlier. The workshop lay 11 miles out beyond the last regular route, so she tightened Lenora's tool roll beneath her coat and began walking. Traffic pushed cold spray across the shoulder of Route 39. Her shoes softened at the seams. By dusk, she had covered 7 miles, stopping only when the rain turned to sleet and the fields began losing their edges. She found an open hay barn behind a leaning fence and slept beneath loose timothy, careful not to disturb the baled rows. The temperature fell to 28 degrees. Each time she woke, she flexed her fingers around the canvas roll to make certain it was still there. Morning came pale and windless. A skin of ice covered the puddles, and the last 4 miles took nearly 3 hours. East Liverpool appeared gradually through the river haze. Brick walls, narrow streets, church towers, and old pottery buildings pressed into the hills. Sylvie passed Thompson's Hardware, its windows crowded with stovepipe elbows, the hot dog shop, breathing onions into the morning, Dawson's funeral home behind clipped yews, River City Feed and Seed with salt blocks stacked beside the door, and Patterson's Bakery, where a woman turned loaves onto a cooling rack without looking up. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a sandstone building whose steps had been worn shallow at their centers. Sylvie stood beneath the portico and scraped mud from her soles before entering. A ceiling's fan revolved above rows of metal cabinets. The room smelled of paper, floor wax, and the faint mineral damp of old records. Behind the counter sat a woman with a pencil tucked through a gray braid. Her nameplate read Mrs. Nadine Wells, Deputy Clerk. Sylvie placed the folded notice and $5 bill on the counter. Mrs. Wells looked first at the bill, then at Sylvie's wet cuffs. "You came for the McKinley Run parcel?" "Yes, ma'am." The clerk opened a ledger thick enough to stop a door. "You understand the roof is open in 3 places?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the well has not been certified since 1979?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no electric service and no legal septic system?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the demolition order transfers with ownership?" Sylvie kept both palms flat on the counter. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Wells studied her for several seconds. One loose strand of gray hair moved whenever the ceiling fan passed overhead. Then she drew the bill toward herself and lifted a brass county stamp from its ink pad. The stamp fell once, hard and exact, leaving a purple seal across the deed. "Take Route 39 west for 2 miles, she said. "Turn right on McKinley Run Road after the stone culvert. The lane is unmarked. If you reach the old water tower, you've gone too far." She slid the deed forward, but her hand remained on it. "Mercer," she said. "Your surname?" Sylvie nodded. "Any relation to Lenora Mercer?" The room seemed to narrow round the turning fan. "She was my grandmother." Mrs. Wells leaned back. Her chair gave a small leather sigh. "Lenora brought porcelain pieces here when I was a girl. My father collected damaged pottery from estates, and she repaired what he could not bear to throw away. Once, she gave me a doll eye the size of a pea." blue-gray, with one painted vein. Sylvie said nothing. The clerk opened a side drawer and removed a yellowed index card. The card listed the parcel's former owner as Ruth Bellweather Mercer, deceased, with Lenora's name written beneath it in pencil as an emergency contact. The handwriting was cramped and old, but the connection stood plainly between them. "Your grandmother tried to acquire that workshop in 1988, Mrs. Wells said. The estate was tangled in unpaid liens. By the time the county cleared them, she had stopped asking." Sylvie looked at the purple seal drying on the deed. Did she work there? I do not know. Mrs. Wells released the paper, but she knew what was inside. Outside, the rain had passed. Sylvie followed the highway until the buildings thinned into garages, small houses, and wooded slopes. At the stone culvert, she turned onto McKinley Run Road, where the pavement narrowed beside a creek the color of tea. A man in brown coveralls stood beside a mailbox repairing its wooden post. His left hand was missing 2 fingertips. At his boots, a black and tan hound watched Sylvie without barking. "You headed to the old iWorks?" he asked. She stopped. He nodded toward the deed protruding from her coat. "County paper carries a particular look." "I bought it this morning." The man pressed the post upright with his knee. "Name's Earl Dobbins, dog's Amos. He'll visit but won't steal." The hound's tail struck the gravel once. Walnut Lane is just past the bend. The lane lay beneath 2 rows of black walnut trees, their branches bare and interlocked. Fallen hulls had stained the mud almost violet. Sylvie walked between them until the workshop emerged from the slope. It was smaller than the county photograph suggested, perhaps 30 feet long and 18 wide, built of red brick over a sandstone foundation. The roof sagged along its eastern edge beneath moss-dark shingles. A square chimney rose above the rear wall, split from crown to flashing. Over the entrance hung a tin sign, rusted nearly blank except for 4 surviving words: Mercer and Bellweather Ocular Works. Sylvie stood beneath it until a drop of water fell through one of the nail holes and struck the deed. The front door had swollen in its frame. She set down her pillowcase, braced one shoulder against the wood, and pushed. The lower hinge tore free with a brittle crack. Dust lifted from the floor in a slow sheet, carrying the odors of wet brick, mouse nests, cold ashes, and something mineral that reminded her of Lenora's glaze jars. The front room held a counter, 2 stools, and shelves bowed beneath empty cardboard boxes. Thousands of white porcelain half-eyes lay across the floor, some no larger than lentils, others broad enough for cabinet dolls. They clicked beneath Sylvie's soles like tiny teeth. Along one wall, rain had entered through broken panes and fed a green fur of mold over the plaster. She crossed into the back room. There stood the kiln. Its iron jacket rose to her shoulder, round-bellied and riveted, with enamel doors set one above the other. Green corrosion scaled the hinges. The fire-brick lining had collapsed near the lower chamber, and black slag sealed part of the draft vent. Beside it rested cracked metal trays, plaster molds, and a workbench furred with gray dust. When Sylvie drew one finger across the bench, a pale stripe appeared beneath it. The air tasted of rust. Somewhere inside the wall, water dropped at regular intervals. She heard the walnut branches scrape the roof, the creak beyond the lane, and the soft shifting of broken porcelain each time she moved. On the far shelf she found a stoppered jar. Its paper label had browned but remained legible. Opal white, second fire. She opened it carefully. The dry glaze inside smelled faintly of chalk and old rain. Sylvie replaced the stopper. Near sunset, she cleared a place in the front room with a warped broom. She pushed the porcelain halves into a shallow mound, choosing one intact eye and setting it on the counter. Its unpainted surface caught the last window light with a dull white sheen. Her supper was the final heel of bread from Patterson's bakery, given to her when the woman at the cooling rack saw her counting coins. Sylvie ate half and wrapped the rest. She folded her coat beneath her head and lay on the floorboards with Lenora's tool roll against her chest. Cold gathered from the foundation. The roof ticked as the temperature fell. Once, Amos barked from somewhere beyond the walnut trees, and a few seconds later the sound of the creek returned. Sylvie watched moonlight move across the porcelain eye on the counter. From the floor, its blank curve seemed less like an object than the beginning of one, unfinished but not ruined. The silence had passed through the fire, and it was still waiting. At first light, Sylvie carried the stoppered glaze jar outside and began learning what the property would permit. The well stood 30 yards behind the workshop beneath a rotted cedar cover. She tied a brick to a length of sash cord, lowered it through the black opening, and counted until the splash came at 19 feet. The first bucket rose brown with leaf tannin. By the fourth, the water cleared enough to show the dented bottom of her tin cup, though she boiled every drop before drinking. The outhouse leaned east behind a screen of sumac. Its door would not close until she lifted it by the lower corner, and one plank beside the seat had softened through. She marked it with charcoal so she would not step there in darkness. By the third night, she knew the floor's language. The board near the front counter chirped once. 2 planks beside the kiln answered with a long complaint. The back threshold gave no sound at all. She practiced walking from her blanket to the door without waking the whole building, placing each heel where old nails held firm. On the 4th morning, she returned to town with a list written on the back of the demolition notice. Thompson's Hardware occupied a deep, narrow room with oak drawers running to the ceiling. The air held seed dust, machine oil, and the warm iron smell of a stove burning near the register. Its owner, Harold Thompson, wore a magnifying lens clipped over his right spectacle, making that eye appear twice its proper size. He read Sylvie's list and then looked at the coins in her palm. "I own the eye works now," she said. "So Nadine told half the town. I need to make it safe before spring." Harold removed the lens. Without it, his face seemed suddenly tired. "You need more than what $5 buys. I can work." That was not the question. Sylvie placed the county deed beside the coins. Harold read the seal, opened a ledger, and wrote, "Mercer, Sylvie," in blue ink. 30-day account, he said. "No interest. You pay when you can, but you tell me before you cannot." "I will." He added a stained booklet titled Home Repairs for Farm and Workshop, then pushed it across the counter. "This one is free because the roof chapter is wrong in 2 places. I corrected them in pencil." She bought a chimney brush for $6.75, 50 feet of polypropylene rope for $3.20, a wire hand brush for $1.10, stove cement for $2.85, and a galvanized bucket for $1.95. Harold wrapped the brush in brown paper and wrote each amount beneath her name. Back at the workshop, Sylvie tied the chimney brush to the rope and fed it upward from the firebox. It stopped 6 feet above her head. She pulled, twisted, and tried again. A hard crust answered from inside the flue. The booklet advised working from the roof, but the eastern slope would not carry her weight. She found an ash cleanout behind the kiln, removed its rusted plate, and pushed a length of iron conduit upward until the obstruction cracked. Creosote fell in glossy black plates, sharp-edged as broken glaze. The smell filled the room at once. Tar, old smoke, and rain trapped for decades. She covered her mouth with a damp strip of cloth and worked in 40-minute turns. First the conduit, then the brush, then the bucket. Each pass released soot that settled into her hair and the seams of her hands. Twice the rope snagged. Once the brush head came loose, and she spent an hour fishing it down with a bent nail tied to cord. After 7 hours, daylight showed through the upper flue. She sealed 2 gaps around the stove collar with cement, waited until morning, and built a test fire from walnut twigs no thicker than her thumb. Smoke entered the room, curled beneath the cracked plaster, then changed direction as the flue warmed. It drew upward in one steady ribbon. Sylvie added 3 split pieces of dry wood. The iron jacket clicked. Heat moved across the floorboards slowly, reaching her knees before her face. In the galvanized bucket, she boiled well water and stirred in oats Harold had tucked beneath the repair manual. She ate beside the kiln with the bowl balanced in both hands. It was the first hot meal she had cooked for herself since March. Afterward, she began clearing the workroom. She chose what deserved to be lifted first. A copper drying rack with 12 bent arms, a hand-cranked slip mixer whose paddles had frozen in a skin of clay, 6 shallow firing trays stamped ELPCO, a brass caliper fine enough to measure an eyelid curve, 3 rabbit hair brushes sealed inside a glass tube, a row of pigment jars labeled cobalt, umber, chrome green, and blood vein. a foot-operated magnifying stand with one lens missing. Beneath the bench, a bismuth mold nearly 2 feet across rested on a timber cradle blackened by heat. The mold was unlike the smaller plaster forms scattered nearby. It had been cast in 2 thick hemispheres and fastened by 12 bolts. Each face carried dozens of tiny concave impressions, arranged in rings according to size. Corrosion mottled the alloy in pink, silver, and dull violet patches. Sylvie brushed ash from the upper surface. One bolt near the center had a head too dark and smooth to match the others. She touched it with the tip of Lenora's tweezers. The sound was wrong. The surrounding metal answered with a dense, brief note. The blackened bolt gave back a hollow tick. Sylvie worked around the mold, tapping every few inches. Most of it sounded solid. A narrow section near the center returned the same small emptiness. She knelt, pressed her shoulder to one side, and tried to shift the mold on its cradle. It moved less than expected. Bismuth was heavy, but not this heavy. She fetched the bathroom scale someone had left beneath the front counter. Its face was cracked, yet the spring still moved. By levering one side of the cradle onto the scale and doubling the reading, she estimated nearly 300 pounds, far beyond the casting dimensions shown in an old inventory card. She cleaned the false bolt with lamp oil. Beneath the soot was a shallow slot. The screwdriver from Harold's free manual kit did not fit. Sylvie opened Lenora's canvas roll and selected the narrow steel blade her grandmother had used for separating mold seams. The edge entered the slot exactly. She turned it a quarter rotation, something released inside the casting. A circular plate rose less than the width of a fingernail. Sylvie eased it upward with the tweezers and found, beneath it, a disc of cedar fitted into the bismuth core. Its grain had darkened but remained dry. A loop of waxed thread lay flat against its center. She did not pull it at once. She swept the bench. She washed her hands. She placed the intact porcelain eye beside the mold and set the lamp where its light would fall without casting her shadow into the opening. Then she drew the thread upward. The cedar disc resisted at one edge before lifting free with a soft suction. Below it lay a cylindrical cavity lined with oiled wool. No damp had entered. The hollow extended nearly to her elbow. The first package was wrapped in linen and tied with blue thread. Inside rested 2 platinum-tipped firing tongs, a set of ivory-handled pigment knives, and a brush case carved from walnut. Each tool bore the same small mark, an eye enclosed by a flame. The second package contained bars of raw material separated by paper, cobalt glass, powdered feldspar sealed in wax, and thin strips of platinum no wider than grass blades. Beneath them lay a palm-sized stamping die, also platinum, cut with concentric iris lines so delicate they seemed drawn rather than engraved. The third object was a green tin box. Its clasp had rusted shut. Sylvie worked lamp oil into the hinge and opened it one fraction at a time. The lid gave with a dry breath. Inside were paper packets, coin rolls, and banknotes bound with cotton tape. A sealed envelope lay on top. Across its face, in brown ink, someone had written, "For the one who opens the eyes again." Sylvie recognized neither the sentence nor the hand. She set the envelope aside unopened. She counted the money on the clean bench. The banknotes came first. 5s, 10s, 20s, and older $100 bills with narrow portraits, each flattened between sheets of onion paper. The coins required longer. There were Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half-dollars, Indian head cents, and $20 St. Gaudens gold pieces wrapped separately in wool. One roll contained a Purple Heart medal dated 1944. Its ribbon faded toward gray, with the name Alias Mercer engraved on the reverse. Sylvie counted once, wrote the totals in charcoal, and counted again. $38,500. The number did not change. She returned every coin to its paper, every note to its bundle, and every tool to the linen in the order she had found it. She did not put them back inside the mold. Instead, she carried the tin box to the front room and placed it beneath her folded coat. The envelope remained on the bench. Night came clear. Sylvie closed the swollen door and walked beyond the walnut lane to where McKinley Run widened before joining the Ohio. The water moved black beneath the stars, bearing small pieces of reflected town light around the bend. She sat on a limestone block and held the unopened letter between both hands. $38,500 rested inside a condemned workshop behind her. Enough for food, lumber, glass, taxes, and years without asking Travis or Elaine for anything. Still, she did not break the seal. Some things Lenora had taught her were damaged by heat applied too quickly. They required a slow rise, a measured pause, and the discipline to leave the kiln closed until morning. Sylvie watched the river until the cold entered her sleeves. Then she returned along the creek, carrying the letter level before her. The silence had passed through fire, and it was still waiting. At dawn, Sylvie set the envelope beside the intact porcelain eye and turned it toward the window. The handwriting had changed since the labels on Lenora's glaze jars. It was thinner, more deliberate, each line leaning slightly downhill. But the capital M carried the same hooked stroke Sylvie had watched form on birthday cards and repair invoices. She touched the ink once with the back of her finger, then opened the seal with the narrow mold blade. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have already done the difficult work. You listened closely enough to hear that the mold was not solid, and you opened it without breaking what was inside. That tells me more about you than a name could. I am writing from Mercy Hospital in Pittsburgh, where Dr. Samuel Klein has told me the cancer has moved into my liver and that I should put my affairs in order. He says this gently. I have asked him not to soften the measurements." The work began with Ada Bellweather, born in 1848 near Trenton, New Jersey. She came to East Liverpool in 1871 and married Thomas Mercer, a kiln setter. Their daughter Ruth, born in 1874, learned to paint veins and irises before she could sign her whole name. Ruth's son, Elias, was born in this cottage in 1901 and carried the trade through the Depression until he went to France in 1944 and did not return. His daughter Margaret kept the shop alive alone, and Margaret taught me, Lenora Mercer, born in 1938, at this same bench. The trade closed on September 18, 1956. After that came more than 30 years of silence. The factories changed. Composition eyes replaced fired ones. Dealers wanted speed and sameness. I kept the formulas because I could not bear to see exact work confused with useless work. You will find the opal ground in the rear cabinet. Sieve it through 80 mesh before mixing. Use 3 parts feldspar, 2 parts silica, and 1 part tin oxide by weight. Fire the first body slowly to 1030 degrees Fahrenheit, hold 20 minutes, then let the kiln fall below 300 before opening. For the iris, place the darkest ring first and turn the eye beneath the brush, never the brush around the eye. The final glaze should reach 1060 degrees, no higher, or the vein work will drown. The platinum dye is for the smallest pupils. Warm it for 7 minutes near the kiln mouth before pressing. Cold platinum bruises soft to porcelain. The money is not payment for finding this. It belongs to the work and to whoever is willing to keep it honest. Use what is needed to make the roof sound, the chimney safe, the windows whole, and your hands steady. Inheritance is not what one person leaves behind. It is the work another person agrees to continue. Elias's medal is inside because the grief should not be sold. If you can, place it someday where his name is kept. I do not know whether you are family. I have learned that blood is a poor measure when labor, patience, and care are absent. Whoever opens this mold carefully has already entered the line. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Lenora Ruth Mercer, November 6, 1988. Sylvie read the letter twice. The first time, she reached the signature and stopped breathing until the room shifted around her. The second time, she followed every instruction as though Lenora sat across the bench correcting the angle of her wrist. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases and returned them to the envelope without smoothing away the marks left by 35 years. On the back of the final sheet, Lenora had drawn a small map. Sylvie carried it through the rear door, past the well and down a slope tangled with briars. The drawing marked 3 walnut trees and a stone aligned with the chimney. 2 trees remained. The third had fallen long ago, its stump hollowed by rain. She paced 12 feet north from the stump and found a flat sandstone marker beneath dead leaves. Moss covered its upper half. She scraped it away with a cedar chip. The same craft mark appeared there, an eye enclosed by a flame. Below it, faint but readable, were 4 names: Ada, Ruth, Margaret, Lenora. Sylvie knelt without touching the letters. Wind moved through the walnut branches, dropping one blackened hull beside her knee. She set it upright on the stone and left it there. Inside, she chose the smallest heirloom object, a narrow brass alcohol lamp from the linen package. Its wick had dried hard, so she trimmed it, filled the reservoir with fuel from an old cabinet bottle, and struck a match. The flame rose blue at its base and steady at the tip. She placed Lenora's rabbit hair brush beside it. For the first time since the funeral, the brush cast a working shadow. That afternoon, kindness returned to her in separate, ordinary forms. Harold Thompson arrived with 2 panes of salvaged glass tied upright in his truck and pretended not to notice the tin box beneath her coat. Earl Dobbins brought a covered bucket from his certified well, while Amos inspected the front room and lay beside the warm kiln. Mrs. Wells sent a brown envelope containing copies of every Mercer and Bellweather deed she could locate. The woman from Patterson's bakery left a loaf wrapped in paper, its crust still warm enough to soften the butter tucked beside it. None of them asked what Sylvie had found. They asked what needed doing first. Before we go farther, think of one small kindness someone gave you when you had no way to return it. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a place to sleep, or simply a person who believed your word. Tell us about that kindness in the comments and let their name be remembered here. After dark, Sylvie laid the platinum tongs, pigment knives, walnut brush case, and Lenora's letter beside her blanket. She placed the purple heart nearest the wall, away from the damp. The alcohol lamp burned until the room had warmed enough for sleep, and when Sylvie closed her eyes, the old tools remained within reach of her hand. On December 3rd, the first snow arrived before daylight and measured 6 inches against the sandstone step. Sylvie read Harold's roof chapter 3 times, including both penciled corrections. The workshop measured 30 by 18 feet, but the slope and waste brought the order to 12 squares of shingles, 3 rolls of 15-pound felt, and 30 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. She copied the figures twice before showing them to Harold. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet polished smooth at the grip. "Grip, my brother Paul's," he said. "He died before he learned to lend it." A retired roofer named Mr. Vance came up McKinley Run Road the next morning carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. He was 72, narrow as a cedar board, with one white eyebrow that lifted whenever Sylvie measured poorly. When she offered payment, he closed her fingers around the money. "Keep it for shingles." They worked 11 days. The eastern roof had to be opened first. 2 rafters were soft where rain had entered, so Mr. Vance showed her how to sister each one with new pine, clamp it flush, and drive bolts through soundwood. They snapped a chalk line across the felt and worked upward in deliberate rows. He taught her a 3-stroke nail technique. Set, drive, finish, no pounding after the head lay flat. That nail's proud. Sylvie leaned closer, pull it. By the 4th day, her shoulders shook each evening when she lifted the water bucket. By the 7th, she could judge shingle exposure without reaching for the ruler. On December 14th, they set the final ridge cap beneath a sky the color of unglazed porcelain. Snowmelt ran down the new roof and missed the interior entirely. In January, the chimney began shedding itself. The outer bricks had spalled into thin red shells, and mortar powdered beneath Sylvie's thumb. She removed each loose joint with a narrow chisel, brushing the cavities until no grit remained. Harold sold her hydraulic lime and fire clay, then showed her the mixture on the back of a receipt. 2 parts lime, 1 part fire clay, enough water to make the mortar hold on an inverted trowel. For 3 weeks, she worked in temperatures that stayed in the 20s. Bare hands gave her better control around the damaged flue tiles, but they went numb every 15 minutes. She warmed them against a jar filled with heated creek stones, then returned to the scaffold. Brick by brick, she rebuilt the crown, packed the joints, and shaped a slight slope so rain would run away from the opening. On January 29th, Earl stood in the yard while she lit the test fire. The first smoke rose straight through the new cap. No gray ribbon leaked from the mortar. No soot entered the room. Earl watched for several minutes, scratched Amos behind one ear, and said, "Draw's clean." That evening, Sylvie cooked beans on the kiln stove and left the chimney damper open until the last coal turned dull. The floors, weighted beneath decades of soot and spilled glaze, they were white pine planks fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails, each head dark and irregular. Sylvie rented a random orbit sander from Harold for $14 a day. She drove the proud nails below the surface with a punch, then made 3 passes over the boards. 80 grit to lift the blackened skin, 120 to level the scratches, and 220 to close the grain. Dust entered everything. It coated her eyelashes, filled the folds of Lenora's letterbox, and turned the window ledges pale. She sealed the heirlooms beneath canvas and worked with both doors open even when cold air moved through the workshop hard enough to stiffen her fingers. The first coat of oil vanished into the pine almost at once. She waited overnight, rubbed the surface with cloth, and laid down 2 more coats, allowing a full 48-hour cure after the last. The boards changed from dark honey toward mahogany, revealing arcs in the grain where workers had once pivoted between the bench and kiln. One morning, Sylvie woke before dawn and could not make her hands reach for the sander. She walked to the marsh below the creek instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg folded beneath its body, motionless as fired clay. For nearly an hour it did nothing. Then its head struck forward and a silver fish disappeared into its beak. Sylvie remained there until afternoon. She did no work that day. By February, the windows became the next honest problem. There were 8 altogether. 3 held no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 retained an original pane dated in the county records to 1788, its surface wavering with tiny trapped bubbles. Sylvie removed that pane last, labeled every edge in pencil, and stored it upright between blankets while she repaired the sash. Harold showed her how to knead Dieppe 33 glazing putty until it warmed, roll it into a narrow rope, and press it into the rabbet without trapping air. She set each pane against the bed, fixed it with glazing points, then drew the putty knife in one unbroken stroke to form a clean bevel that shed water. The counterweights had fallen inside the walls. Sylvie opened the pockets, threaded quarter-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley, and tied a figure-8 knot at the iron weight. The first knot slipped, the second held. By the 5th window, she could balance the sash so it stayed wherever her hand released it. She returned the 1788 pane to the south wall. Its distortions bent the walnut trees into soft vertical waves, preserving every flaw that newer glass would have erased. On the final window, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch beyond the sill. It tilted its black-capped head while Sylvie pressed the last bead of putty smooth. She held the knife still until the bird flew. By late February, the walls began giving up their loose plaster. Behind the fallen sections, Sylvie found hand-split oak lath with horsehair plaster pressed through the gaps in rough keys. Near the chimney, her first 3 patches failed. 1 cracked overnight. 1 sagged from too much water. The 3rd came away whole when she touched its edge. Harold brought an old feed sack from his barn, half filled with the clean horsehair his wife had once saved for repairs. Sylvie mixed it into limester until the fibers disappeared through the mass, then worked in 3 coats, a scored scratch coat pressed hard against the lath, a 3/8-inch brown coat left to cure for 72 hours, and a 1/8-inch finish coat polished with a damp steel trowel. The new work did not match the old wall perfectly. It held the light differently, and small ridges remained where her wrist had tired. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it once, not as a promise, but as a measurement. Doris Keller, who owned the hot dog shop, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She had flour on one sleeve and wore red-framed glasses that slipped whenever she looked down. Inside the bags were biscuits, boiled eggs, or the end slices from a ham. When Sylvie carried money into the cafe, Doris pushed it back beneath the sugar jar. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." A week later, Caleb Dobbins came up the lane on a green Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul laid across the handlebars. He was 16, all knees and wrists, with a crescent scar beneath his chin. Without introducing himself, he began dividing the walnut rounds Earl had left beside the shed. Sylvie offered him $2. Caleb shook his head and drove the maul into another round, my mother said. "About your grandfather." He did not explain which story his mother had told, and Sylvie did not ask. By noon, the wood was stacked beneath the eaves in alternating rows so air could pass through it. Reverend Boyd walked McKinley Run Road every morning at 7. He wore a black felt hat polished pale along the brim and carried no Bible. Each time he passed the workshop, he tipped his hat toward Sylvie. On the morning she finished the plaster, he stopped at the lane, looked up at the sound roof and drawing chimney, and raised one hand. "Keep her hand steady." Then he continued toward town. Sylvie had postponed the cellar until February 11. The door lay beneath the rear bench, its iron ring hidden by ash. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor. The air smelled of mineral water and old apples. At the center stood a dressed granite slab, level with the stones around it, carved with the eye and flame mark. Sylvie cleaned its edges but did not lift it. Under the 3rd step, her fingers found a small oak box wedged behind the riser. Its lid had swollen shut. She eased it open with a putty knife and discovered a brass key whose bow had been shaped into the same eye and closed by flame. Beneath the key lay a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the cottage before the walnut trees had reached the roofline. She held a rabbit hair brush in one hand and a shallow firing tray in the other. The set of her mouth, the narrow bridge of her nose, and the slight tilt of her left shoulder belonged so precisely to Sylvie that she turned the plate over twice, searching for some trick of reflection. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words Margaret Mercer, daughter of founder Ruth Bellweather Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903. Sylvie carried this key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside the unopened pigment jars. She tried it in the front door, the workbench drawers, the kiln cabinet, and the old deed chest. It fit nothing. She left it where the morning sun could touch the brass and did not force an answer from it. March loosened the snow from the shaded banks. McKinley Run grew loud with meltwater, and pale walnut catkins appeared before the leaves. The workshop smelled less of damp brick now and more of lime, oil, and wood smoke. Sylvie decided not to begin the full ocular work that spring. She would spend 1 coin from the cash on materials and no more. She ordered fresh porcelain body, a small quantity of tin oxide, and clean feldspar. At Lenora's bench, she practiced on flat samples no larger than buttons, testing ratios and kiln positions before risking a single curved eye. Some blistered, some clouded. One emerged with a gray bloom beneath the glaze and went into the failure drawer. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sylvie completed the first eye. It began as a measured spoonful of porcelain slip poured into the smallest restored mold. She waited until the shell reached the thickness of a thumbnail, drained the excess, and released the half-sphere without bruising its rim. After the first firing, she laid down the opal ground, then turned the eye beneath Lenora's single-hair brush while painting the dark outer ring. The iris was gray-blue, with amber nearest the pupil and 1 red vein entering from the lower edge. She fired the final glaze to 1,060 degrees and did not open the kiln until the chamber fell below 300. When she lifted the eye into window light, the iris seemed to follow her because the platinum dye had pressed its concentric lines at an angle too slight for the conscious mind to catch. It was not movement. It was careful stillness made visible. The interior around her had become sound without becoming new. The white pine floor carried dark paths between bench and kiln. 8 repaired windows held winter light, including the wavering pane from 1788. Lime plaster covered the walls without hiding their unevenness. Copper racks hung above labeled glaze jars, and the brass lamp stood ready beside Lenora's letter. The key remained on the mantel until the first hard freeze that December. A storm split one of the oldest walnut limbs and dropped it across the lane. Caleb, now broad enough through the shoulders to swing the maul one-handed, came to help cut it. Beneath a loosened plate of bark, Sylvie noticed a green edge set into the trunk about 6 feet above the ground. The brass key fit the plate. Inside the walnut was a narrow lead-lined cavity. Dry despite the years, it contained a folded 48-star American flag and a note wrapped in waxed cloth. The ink had faded to brown, but the signature was Margaret Mercer's. The note was dated June 12, 1944, 6 days after the Normandy landings. Margaret wrote that Elias had carried the flag in his kit when he left Ohio. A chaplain returned it after Elias died in France, together with the medal that would arrive months later. She hid the flag in the tree because the workshop had been searched for scrap during wartime drives, and because grief, like certain glazes, needed darkness before it could be handled without breaking. She asked that the flag be opened only by someone who had restored the eyeworks rather than stripped it. Sylvie unfolded it across the cleaned workbench. The cloth held creases sharp enough to remember the hands that had made them. On June 6, 2025, she carried Elias Mercer's Purple Heart to Riverview Cemetery in East Liverpool, where his name appeared on the family marker beneath a carved cross. It was the 81st anniversary of D-Day. There was no ceremony. Earl stood beside her with his cap in both hands. Caleb placed the folded flag against the stone. Reverend Boyd spoke the same 4 words he had offered at the lane. Sylvie left the medal in a sealed display case fixed to the rear of the marker, protected from rain but visible through glass. Of the cash, she used 4 coins. 1 paid for roofing materials, 1 paid for chimney brick and lime. 1 bought the porcelain and glaze ingredients for her first year of trials. The 4th covered the cemetery case and its brass fittings. The remaining money stayed wrapped in its original paper. Sylvie returned it to the bismuth mold with copies of every receipt, Lenora's formula book, and a new inventory written in her own hand. She replaced the cedar disc and blackened false screw, but added a narrow line inside the cavity. For the next one who listens. The shop reopened without a sign in a newspaper. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard beneath the church suppers and farm auctions. Porcelain eye repair and matching Mercer and Bellweather. Ocular works inquire here. The first request came from a woman in Salem with a German bisque doll whose left eye had shattered in a fall. The second arrived by mail from Kentucky. By spring, Doris kept more than 40 names in a small address book beside the register, each waiting for Sylvie to work slowly enough. No one was promised a date. Caleb returned one April evening carrying a hand-carved walnut sign across the back of his bicycle. He had grown too tall for the frame, and his knees rose nearly to the handlebars. The board read, Mercer and Bellweather Ocular. Works and daughters. Sylvie ran her thumb across the last 2 words. There were no daughters after Margaret, she said. Caleb shrugged. A shaving of walnut clung to his sleeve. There could be. They hung the sign beneath the old tin one, leaving both visible. The weathered lettering above told what had survived. The new carving below left a room for what had not happened yet. That winter, Sylvie began her own letter. She used brown ink and the clean side of Lenora's original envelope as a guide for the fold. She wrote down the revised firing schedule, the source of the new porcelain body, the exact behavior of cobalt under the restored kiln's hotter rear shelf, and the mistake that caused gray blooming beneath opal glaze. Then she wrote the opening, My dear one, whoever you are. She did not describe Travis, the empty bank account, or the curb where Elaine had lowered her eyes. Those belonged to another life and required no inheritance. Instead, Sylvie wrote about the roof angle, the walnut key, the chickadee at the 8th window, and the names of people who had carried water, bread, glass, tools, and prayer without asking what she could repay. At the bottom, she left half the page blank. The silence had passed through fire, and it was still waiting. On certain evenings after the last firing, Sylvie carried the completed eyes to the south window and placed them in rows beneath the old glass. The uneven pane bent the walnut branches across their polished surfaces. From the road, the workshop appeared dark except for 1 lamp and a dozen small reflections holding steady inside. The porcelain doll eyes Kiln waits. It has always waited. Years earlier, when Mrs. Wells accepted Sylvie's $5. She had placed the bill in the clerk's desk drawer instead of depositing it. It remained there beneath the yellowed parcel card, folded once through the center. On its edge, in purple county ink, she had written 1 word,